Thanks very much. For those of you here last year, you'll remember that I chaired some of the discussions as well. And for those of you who weren't, just to explain my connection, it's less so to the church and more to Rob, who I was in college with. It's over 20 years ago now. Rob used to describe me in those days as the man who kept him on the straight and narrow. Now, that literally meant that I could cook. Since then, Rob has gone on to be a man of the church, and I've gone to work for RTE, so we've gone in very divergent paths. Let me introduce our panel here for the next half an hour. First beside me, Os Guinness, philosopher, author, and social scientist, who you will have heard in the earlier discussion. David McWilliams is not with us. We'll be talking to him a little bit later on. John Foong from Google at the end here. And beside John is Roger Childs, my colleague at RTE, is head of religious programming. And beside him, Patsy McGarry, religious correspondent and columnist with the Irish Times. Would you give them all a warm welcome, please? Some of the discussion points that Rob had asked me to put was the relevance of church in the media. I'm going to put this to Roger, first of all, as my colleague, in what I don't think Roger would disagree with me is a part of RTE that is under, to some extent, a degree of threat, because RTE, like a lot of public bodies at the moment is, well, we're running out of money, and religious programming is seen, I don't think you disagree, Roger, as being quite vulnerable in cuts that are happening at RTE. Why is that? I mean, is it just because the area is seen as a minority interest, or are you just subject to the same cuts as the rest of us?
I would disagree. I don't feel vulnerable, actually, because and particularly, funnily enough, in the light of the Father Reynolds debacle last year, religious programs was actually a very helpful public service fig leaf, which was demonstrably not anti-Catholic, not anti-religious. It was one of the ways that the organisation could demonstrate commitment to that area of the forest, really. So we are small, we're poor. There was a Metro Herald highlight this week. We had a programme on called Beyond Belief, very late in the margins, 11:15 on Tuesday night. And I was delighted to see that it was pick of the day in the Metro Herald, and it said, "It seems quaint in this day and age that RTE still insists on pursuing religious programs, but actually some of the strongest offerings in the schedules are coming from this area at the moment." I thought, phew, that's great. I'm all for low expectations. And I arrived in a job where there were very, very low expectations, which means that you can surprise people, and hope that's what I try to do. So, for instance, at the moment, we're using the Trojan horse of celebrity interviews with The Meaning of Life, with Gay Byrne, to introduce a bit of religious dialogue and thought into mainstream broadcasting. And my perception is that far from being under threat, that's an area of growth. I was asked to do a second series this year when one had been funded in the first place. Would you believe, in my view, now that it's sort of recalibrated and refocused on belief, it's remembered that it has the word believe in the title, actually in terms of public response, in terms of viewer numbers, and in terms of this thing called appreciation index, which is one of our sort of ways of measuring how much and how many people like it, it's going in the right direction. We have another new series called The Moment of Truth, which is kicking off in November and December. All of these things are happening at a time when other departments are losing output, other departments are losing people. So I don't feel under threat. Actually, you know, I see it as a time of opportunity in a very strange way. The difficulty I have is in sort of walking that line where we can both. Well, I use the acronym RICE for what I do. My job is to reflect, interrogate, celebrate, and explain the religious life of this culture. And it's really important that we don't lose touch with any of those letters, that we do interrogate, but we also celebrate. So we are there for the Eucharistic Congress, waving the papal banners, but then we're also able to do a serious investigation about the Catholic Church leadership's role in handling of abuse. We have to be able to do those things. I don't feel under threat at all.
Patsy, Roger mentioned the Kevin Reynolds debacle at RTE, and it left RTE in a very difficult position where, in the minds of some people, it left RTE open to the accusation of being anti-church. Now, whether that be anti-Catholic church or just anti-church in general. And that's an accusation that's been thrown at you as well to some extent. Has that balance become, the need to question and the balance of questioning become more difficult after the Kevin Reynolds affair?
I expect that we have to be, well, I mean, it's what we should be doing anyhow, Gavin, is standing up our stories, having our facts right. It's basic journalism that was not adhered to in the Kevin Reynolds case, as we all know, and indeed was found in following various investigations. And I think that wasn't just a blow to RTE or its morale, it was a blow to all the media when it came to dealing with this issue, because it is such a difficult issue and because the media is perceived to be anti-church anyhow. But the media is perceived to be anti every political party in the whole area. It's perceived to be anti every financial institution in this state. The media is perceived to be anti everything because the media's job is to hold to account. And if you challenge powerful forces, particularly in society, you're going to, their immediate retort to you, or their defense is, you have an agenda to get them. And the church is no different. And I do not for a minute believe that we are anti-church. Certainly, media has played a huge role, and in particular, and I doff my hat metaphorically to RTE in this, in exposing the shocking abuses that took place in this country under the Catholic Church. I talk about programs like Dear Daughter, featuring Christine Buckley back in 1996. Mary Raftery's extraordinary three-part series, States of Fear, in 1999, which led to the state apologising formally to people who've been in the institutions, to the setting up of the Redress Board, which has compensated approximately 15,000 people who were in those institutions. And then there were those Mary's Cardinal Secrets program in October 2002, which led to the Murphy Commission, which investigated the Dublin Archdiocese, and which then went on to investigate the Cloyne Diocese. So, I mean, RTE's contribution, having said what I said earlier, has been enormous in this area. And I envy it as a print journalist, because we don't have that same access that TV has into the sitting rooms of the country. That's why the Kevin Reynolds episode was such a disaster, because it damaged a terrific brand, I expect and hope temporarily. It created some difficulties for ourselves. I ran into it immediately, a short time ago there myself, with a story about the Bishop of Clonfert. I was interrogated very actively by a journalist from RTE on the Drive Time programme in a manner I'd never expected. But I was delighted, as I said to colleagues afterwards, because there is this view that media is so cosy with each other that we never interrogate each other in the manner that we would interrogate people like in the church or in politics or whatever. And no, I don't for one moment believe, then I wouldn't, would I, that I'm hostile or we are hostile to the church.
Oz, you're a frequent visitor to Ireland, but in Britain and the United States, where you've spent most of your life, how have you found the relationship between church, and I say that in relation to all churches, and the media?
I would say that I always think Christians and the media rather than the church, because I think it's the job of individual Christians with a sense of calling to be in the media, and we need many, many more of them. So I would change the terms a little. But in England, certainly, and I worked for the BBC for a while, and in the US, where I do quite a bit with the media, there's no question that Max Weber's term, tone deaf, is typical. This is not true of Ireland, but it's true of England and America, that the media, by and large, are disproportionately secularist through their education and commitments, and they're tone deaf. They just don't understand a lot of things. And that's a sad fact. I mean, we're seeing a massive global resurgence of religion, with two exceptions. The geographical one is Europe, the social one are the educated, and the media are one representative of the second. So by and large, the media in America and here don't do a great job of picking up the religious dimension.
John, the debate that we're having about the media, I mean, we think of it, particularly given some of the panels that we have here in terms of radio, television, newspapers, the traditional media. You work in an area that I suppose could broadly be defined as new media, where there's a lot more space and perhaps a lot more freedom for religious views to make their views known in perhaps a way that they aren't able to do across the traditional media. Are you finding that with Google?
Yeah, I think at Google we define our success in this area by how many debates are happening, basically. The fact that there is a debate. And I think Google, particularly through things like Google News, likes to see itself as a platform for two things. Number one, something we call democratization, it's a very Web 2.0 word, which basically means that anyone has the right to speak up, right? So we want to encourage both old media in the most respectful way, as well as new media, people yourselves through tweets, through blogs, through YouTube, to kind of express what they're thinking. The second part of the platform is relevance. So, we have thousands of people coming in and saying things, and our job is to kind of judge which is the most relevant, which is different to right. Often the most relevant things are the most right and the most wrong. And a very recent example, you might have seen, there was an extremely controversial video about the Prophet Muhammad that was posted on YouTube, which actually resulted in demonstrations actually at Google headquarters in Ireland as well as around the world. And we really have a mandate, a responsibility to make sure that even, and this video, as far as I understand, is highly erroneous and highly offensive, right? But the fact is that it represents one person's opinion, a very controversial opinion, and our job is to give freedom of speech within the rules of law within the country, and then use our algorithms to determine relevance so the right people are hearing what people are saying.
Do you think that there was a right for that video to be aired, however it may have offended a very large proportion of people?
I mean, generally, what we try and do at Google is two frameworks. One framework is the rule of law. So there are laws that each country has. For example, in places like Thailand, it is against the law to speak against the king, right? And we want to respect the laws in each country. But basically, apart from those things, even if things are not politically advantageous to parties or governments, if they're within the rule of law, we feel it's a responsibility to report that. People and individuals have the right to advocate that things be taken down, and there's a process by which we evaluate those.
Roger, Oz spoke about how I had spoke about the church as opposed to Christians, and I suppose in Ireland it's hard for us to avoid that when we speak about the representation of religion in the media, it's as an institution. I mean, we've been dominated by one institution in this country for a very long time, but there is an element for those from faith that they have almost a fear of being represented in the broad stream media. For example, we're coming up to a children's referendum at the moment where there are many who would perhaps like to have their views held, but they may be regarded with suspicion by others. Is there a difficulty for people who may not necessarily be representing an institution, but representing their own views from being sort of labelled or targeted as being of the religious or of the religious right even here?
I think absolutely there is that fear amongst those people, and probably amongst some of these people as well. I'm trying to combat that by giving people platforms, by creating fora, is that the right word, for dialogue. I think it's fairly inevitable, given recent events in Irish history, that there is a suspicion of institutional religion and a suspicion, nay, on occasions, hostility towards religious authorities. That leads, that's part of a wider landscape in which all authority is being questioned at the moment. Now, it's easy pickings for media. Media's much better at offering questions than answers. And churches are typically about offering answers, not questions. What you're seeing at the moment, sociologically, is that the religions which are attracting people are those that offer the clearest answers, and that's fundamentalism within Islam, fundamentalism within Christianity, fundamentalism within atheism, for that matter. Those who offer certainty attract people. But if you look at who's leaving religions, who's sort of ticking the box for amongst that 6.5% in the latest census saying, I don't belong anymore, it's those who feel that institutional religion doesn't accommodate their questions and doesn't accommodate their uncertainty. So the difficulty, the challenge for someone like me is to offer both, because if all we do is offer questions and no answers, and don't create platforms where people can offer at least the possibility of an answer, then we've failed, because a question on its own is pretty redundant.
Oz, you wanted to come in on that?
I wanted to comment in from an American perspective. Christians actually are in the forefront today, Roger, giving the answers. And you have never had more Christians at the highest level, say, as philosophers in America. The problem is, particularly, people are sick of the institutional expressions. And in America, there is no Christian tradition for the first time that has moral authority in the public square. The Protestant mainline virtually committed suicide in the 60s and has been marginalized since then. And you've seen evangelicals and Roman Catholics vying for voices. Catholics have been deeply discredited. A cardinal said to me recently, maybe another 25 years before we regain our voice in the public square, because of the sex abuse. And the evangelicals, because of the excesses of the Christian right, they've done the same sort of thing. So, very significant from America. No Christian tradition, for the first time in American history, has moral authority in public life.
That's a very different scenario to hear, Patsy.
I don't know, Gavin. When you look at our own churches in general, our main church has no moral authority anymore, and for the very same reason. The Church of Ireland is a minority church. It has kept its head very much below the parapet in the main through the greater part of the history of this state. That is entirely understandable because of the fact that it was effectively discriminated against in de facto, whatever about de jure, not least by the ne temere mixed marriages decree, whereby up to 1970 in particular, if there was a mixed marriage, the Protestant partner had to give a commitment in writing to raise the children as Catholics. That was modified to an oral commitment in 1970, which was seen by the Catholic Church as a huge concession. But so, I mean, the Church of Ireland, though it was costed by a certain degree of wealth here, particularly in the city, although most Protestants in Ireland, in rural Ireland, would be quite poor, it hasn't really posited itself as the alternative moral voice, which is probably a pity now that we need one coming from that particular direction. So there is no strong moral authority. I mean, the major, Ireland is an extraordinary country in that all of our pillars, with one exception, have fallen in recent decades. And that one exception is the GAA. The Gaelic Athletic Association. Myself and Gavin were discussing it in intimate detail earlier on because my county club, my town club, is in the county final in Mayo tomorrow, though I'm from Roscommon and our club is in Mayo. We won't go there. It's potential civil war territory at home, particularly where the Hezbollah wing of the Roscommon Supporters Club is concerned. But, I mean, the church has no moral authority. And I mean, that has damaged it when it comes to campaigning on issues that mean a lot to it, not least the pro-life campaign, which we will see a lot of in coming months. The Fianna Fáil party, the major party that dominated this state for the greater part of its history, has no credibility either, even though it has got a slight blip in the polls last week, in our own polls, and which Mary O'Rourke described at her launch as a swallow. One swallow doesn't make a summer, she said, but a swallow is welcome anyhow. So, I mean, there is no strong institutional moral voice out there in Ireland today. And what it has led to, and as we saw with the census figures the other day, is an increasingly diverse and very interesting society. We have more Muslims than we ever had before. We have officially about 50,000, but the accurate figure is about 70. And they're unusual in that more Muslims tend to be mainly middle class, and they're spread throughout the country. They're not ghettoized as they are in other European countries. Our Orthodox population is about 49,000 as well. Again, they're professionals. There were no Orthodox here about 20 years ago. The Catholic, we've never had more Catholics nominally, 84% of the population, yet practice is way down. In this city, for instance, 14% of Catholics attend weekly Mass on average. In working class areas, it's as low as 2%. Now, insofar as that is a barometer of people's commitment to their faith, Catholicism is in deep trouble in this city and in urban Ireland generally, and indeed anyhow, and we'll probably be talking about this later on today. It's in huge problems. I mean, people are doing increasingly where all the churches are concerned. I might digress a little. I know when, I think it was 2006, we had figures indicating quite a substantial increase in the Church of Ireland population, and I was talking to some senior clergy in the Church of Ireland around that time, and they were bewildered because the people who attend and who contribute, the numbers are going down. So what you have is more and more people claiming cultural identification with the church or with a religion, but not practicing it. So Ireland is becoming a very unchurched society. Meanwhile, we've never had more non-believers or agnostics, over 250,000, 277,000. And in fact, there was a fascinating detail in those figures. 4,900 kids under 1 were down in the census forms as having no belief. Nearly 15,000 secondary school kids were down as having no belief. So there you have parents making a very strong statement. But I might come back to a different subject that Oz talked about earlier on. I don't want to hog things. About the media and about belief. The media is a child of the Enlightenment. We're only 253, maybe 300 years old, going back to the late 1700s, I never get that right. Our job is to ask questions, not to supply answers. Now, Roger has a different role to me. He's a head of religious programming. I'm, as a journalist, there to ask questions, and if it's up to other people to supply the answers. Our job is simply to be skeptical, not necessarily to be hostile or to be doubtful, but to be skeptical, to ask questions until we are satisfied with the answers. And that will be our role into the future.
The problem is, the problem is not the asking questions. The problem is when the media are tone deaf, they're ignorant. And you have, for example, when the Shah fell, in the 10 years prior to that, before the Ayatollah came in, there was no single American media that had any clue that was going to happen. Yeah. And the only one who gave a report on it, it was dismissed as sociology. It dealt with religion. And they didn't realize the religious factor, in fact, in Iran, was the key factor. So it's not that they ask questions, that's terrific. It's the fact that often when they are tone deaf, and not all of them are, that they don't pick up the music.
Also, I'm going to interrupt this discussion just very briefly because we are coming close towards our time. And in terms of asking questions, I'd like you yourselves to ask questions if you have any at this stage to our panel, who will now have to provide the answers. Patsy, sorry.
If I can.
A hand for anybody who'd like to put a question to the panel. Yes.
You say that there's no institutional moral voice. Do you think that there needs to be a specific institutional moral voice, in light of what you said earlier as well? Awareness about local communities doing something. Do you think that in itself speaks louder than an official line from somebody who may be removed from a locality?
When I said institutional moral voice, I didn't mean the church's church. Oh.
I think, if I'm paraphrasing the question right, was whether a line of moral authority coming from individual communities rather than an overarching church. Would that be fair? Yes, okay. Any of you like to address that?
Well, I absolutely agree with you, and I think that's the way it's gone. It's, if you like, it's the democratization of moral authority. It's not institutional anymore, because the institutions are all discredited. So you have, it comes down to the individual and to individual groupings, rather than overarching institutions, certainly as was the experience in this country. But, and I think particularly where young people are concerned, that has a greater appeal, because I don't want to. Another factor, and I mean, striking here, the number of young people who are here this morning, on a Saturday morning, I was saying to Greg, this is the way to go. I mean, one of the great successes of the Eucharistic Congress were the workshops, which wasn't expected at all. There's huge interest and hunger out there in interrogating these issues, theological, and moral, and ethical, and otherwise. But one of the problems the churches has, this is across the board, the Church of Ireland is tearing itself apart over the gay issue. The Catholic Church is tearing itself apart over the gay issue. They have lost the young people. The people who practice today are elderly and middle-aged, for whom those things are live issues. They forget, for instance, that in this country, next year it'll be 20 years since homosexuality was decriminalised in this country. And yet I was watching Craig Doyle last night after the Late Late Show, after Graham Norton. I have a very interesting social life. He had, I'm working today. He had 3 lads on from a gay soccer team. And they explained that their most committed member couldn't be there because he's a teacher. And he couldn't be there because the churches sought a derogation from European equality legislation which bans gays from teaching in schools, church-run schools. I mean, in this day and age, that is active discrimination. In their interest, what the churches are doing is they're protecting their ethos. But really, it's a license to discriminate. And I do believe, and Mary McAleese said it in her book, which actually I'm covering the launch of this afternoon, that, I mean, in time to come, the churches will regard their treatment of homosexuals in the same light as they regard now their treatment of the Jews in the past. But in the process of what they're doing now where gays are concerned is they're alienating, or they're drifting away, or they're undermining their moral authority, where a younger population with a broader, more all-embracing attitude is concerned. And I don't know how I got onto that, but there you are.
Well, do I have time to take a few more questions? Anybody else? Yes.
This is to Roger. I think you came
Good question. Yes, I did. I had to come in with a lot of humility because I was a know-nothing. In terrorist terms, I was a clean skin. You know, I had no baggage in terms of the sort of understanding of the religious and political landscape. I had a lot of learning to do quickly. In some ways, that was very useful because my predecessor was a Catholic priest, and actually his position within RTE became a very difficult one, where I think completely wrongly, he was suspected of being, you know, a Trojan horse, if you like. I don't think that was fair at all. He was actually a very good program maker. Whereas I came in, clearly this man is not pursuing a Catholic agenda. Actually, it enabled me to engage much more positively with Catholicism, oddly enough, in some respects, but also, I hope, to engage with all forms of faith in a very open way. My track record is as a documentary maker, first and foremost. So, you know, I think people accept that there is a sort of, you know, a questioning stance for me, but they're pleasantly surprised to find that I'm not hostile to faith, I hope.
Yes.
I have a question about accountability in the context
To me.
of the debacle, as you said, in RTE. One of the problems, I think, as a result of that is that there's damage to RTE's reputation, which hopefully is only short-lived. One of the things that RTE and the media, perhaps more generally, has been doing quite well is holding our leaders in this country to account. But perhaps the flip side of that is that the citizen in this country has, to some extent, derogated his or her duty to hold our leaders to account. And perhaps is it the case that RTE and other members of the media should be placing more emphasis on encouraging the citizen to hold its leaders to account rather than doing the task for them? Because I think it's one of the great weaknesses in this society we live in now, that our leaders are not held properly to account, other than by the media.
If I could ask John just to take that one up first, because to some extent new media is very different, than rather than being an intermediary in a personal sense of questioning on behalf of an audience or a citizenship, that new media just allows people to get on and do that themselves.
Yeah, I actually would probably slightly disagree with the premise of the question in the terms of, I actually do feel our leaders are held very accountable. And I feel the reason why is, and I will credit both old and new media with this, the kind of cycle time in between something which is offensive or something which is disapproving, between that, people finding out about it, people being able to express that opinion through discussion forums and through polls, and therefore that chain reaction coming all the way back to that leaders rating going down or being disapproved upon, I think it's getting quicker and quicker. So in many ways, I feel with technology, accountability is probably an all-time high, and in many ways, I'm a bit concerned when I look at American media that some of the leaders are held so accountable that any little bad word they say gets kind of blown out of proportion. That's my response.
We could have spent another 3 hours on some of the subjects that you've raised during this time, but I'd like to thank John Foong, Roger Childs, Patsy McGarry and Oz Guinness. Thank you very much for listening to us over the last 5 minutes.
Very interesting.